Welcome back to the Wargrove of Woe. In today's video, we're updating the army tier list so it is up to date with the new Galatian veterans introduced in Age of Sigmar 3rd Edition Season 1. Now, keep in mind with all tier lists, they are subjective, and this is my opinion on what I have seen in person and in data through large-scale tournaments, as well as some personal opinions I have on the various factions. Without further ado, let's get started. We are starting with the Struggle Blessed Zone, Tier 5, and unfortunately, not much has changed here. With the new announcement that the two Destruction Battle Tomes are going to be Ogres and Sons of Behemoth, poor Gloomspite Gitz is left down here. Unfortunately, they still just don't have any good rules, and they haven't benefited from the Galatian veterans. The only real thing that they've benefited from is the ability to have lots of bodies for expert conquerors, but that's about it. Last in Tier 5 is the Blades of Khorne. Unfortunately, the Blades of Khorne haven't got any big real rules updates, and they haven't really benefited too much from the Galatian veterans. The best way to play Blades of Khorne right now is to just fit in as many Bloodthirsters as you can and use them as a big hammer. But otherwise, Blades of Khorne is still in Tier 5. Moving on to Tier 4. Tier 4 has remained mostly the same, with two longtime residents of Tier 4, the Flesh Eater Courts and Beast of Chaos. But some good news is that with some White Dwarf updates and other rules changes in a similar fashion to what I would call a hot fix, the Flesh Eater Courts and the Beast of Chaos have gotten much better, and I would say they are on the cusp of being in Tier 3, but they're just below the median line in terms of power. So it's going to be a little bit of an uphill battle if you play either of these factions, but it's improving, which is a good thing. Beasts of Chaos is a similar story. Their rules update has given them a really big breath of fresh air, and their abilities to increase their rend and the various monstrous actions they got access to have been a real lifesaver for them. Unfortunately, Beasts of Chaos is a big monster army, and it is no longer the age of the monster. It is now all about infantry and who can utilize bounty hunters and expert conquerors the best. Beasts of Chaos can certainly do the expert conquerors, but bounty hunters can be a little bit harder to manage. Next, we have the Tier 3, the good fat middle in terms of power levels. This tier has seen quite a few new additions and a few people moving out of it, which we'll get onto later down in the video. But to start, we have the Fire Slayers. Similar to my last tier list, Fire Slayers' new tome didn't really do much for them. It nerfed a few things and more just was a lot of internal balance, but they're still kind of exactly where they were previously. Next up, we have Hedonites of Slaanesh. Now, Hedonites are still where they were in my last tier list, and in the previous tier list, a lot of people were questioning why I put them in Tier 3, and for a while I was too. I think they should have gone in Tier 4 in the last tier list, but that's besides the point. In their current iteration with the White Dwarf update they got to give them a table of stacking buffs for more depravity points, Hedonites have gotten much better, and we have been seeing some tournament placements for Hedonites, a lot of Blissbarb spam, and Sigvald, a bunch of those kinds of lists coming out, and Hedonites have gotten much better, so I am much more confident in putting them in Tier 3 this time around. Ossiarch Bone Reapers. Nothing's really changed. They are still Tier 3. I think that Galatian Veterans has hurt them a little bit more than it has helped them because their main tactic really is big blobs of Mortek. And Mortek are going to get shredded a lot harder with the Bounty Hunters rules. So I think that they are lower in the Tier 3 grouping than previous, but they're still just kind of low middle of the pack. Now we have Keradron Overlords. Keradron Overlords have, I think, received a buff in the new Season 1 of Age of Sigmar, and that's mostly because they can utilize their mobility and their boats to achieve a lot of the harder battle tactics in Season 1. than most other armies. Being able to get 2 units into your opponent's deployment zone and being able to control a territory piece in your opponent's deployment zone very easily makes scoring much simpler for Keradron Overlords. But they still stick in low tier 3. Cities of Sigmar, same story, different day. Cities of Sigmar is still just Stormcast with a little bit of a different flavor, and that's not really changed. There are rumors kind of floating around that Cities of Sigmar are going to get a massive re-release soon, probably sometime next year. So we'll have to see what they do to change that up so they're not just a auxiliary to Stormcast pretty much. Next up, we have the Disciples of Zinc. Now, this is somewhat of a arbitrary placing because the Disciples of Zinc are getting a new battle tome very, very soon, and so their placing will shift depending on the power of that new book. But at the time of recording, Zinc is a solid tier 3 faction, and this is mostly because they are getting indirectly nerfed by points changes and other rules that are trying to bring down the power of the Legions of the First Prince, which unfortunately utilize a lot of Zinc demons, and so nerfs to Legions of the First Prince are also going to nerf Disciples of Zinc. This is not to say that you cannot succeed with Zinc, they are still a very powerful faction, but they're just on a weaker power curve than they previously were at. Now we have the new Skaven Bug. This one was a bit of a weird placing for me. I was a bit conflicted between keeping them in tier 2 or putting them to tier 3, and I think with their new book, it just barely puts them into tier 3. And that's because a lot of what the new book did is simplify and add consistency to the Skaven book in just enough so it keeps that random my rats are going to blow themselves up aspect that makes Skaven very fun to play, but makes them a little bit more reliable so you're not always blowing yourself up and you can do things now. Especially the 3 Master Clan hero ability is very powerful as a movement tool. They also make good use of Galician veterans' abilities and the expert conquerors. Next we have Ogre tribes. I was debating moving Ogre tribes up to tier 3 because they have a lot of damage potential with the bounty hunters, but at the same time they are very expensive and very squishy, so they get targeted by the bounty hunters much harder, at least the Gutbuster side of things. So Ogres, with their new tome coming up, it's a little bit hard to say where they'll land, but I think that they should stick in tier 3 for the time being. And then last in tier 3, we have the Sons of Behemoth. Now the Sons, they used to be the big boogeyman of early 3.0, just being the big monsters that they are. But with the shift from monsters to gallant veterans, it's shifted in the worse for the Sons. Their new tome is probably going to fix a whole bunch of that or give them tools to work around gallant veterans. But for now, they are tier 3, just because they cannot benefit from Galatian veterans and everybody else can. So, before we continue on with the video, I'd like to give thanks to my Patreon supporters. You all are amazing, and I'd like to give an extra special thanks to Nick Hoff. If you would like to join the Patreon, there's a link in the description below, as well as a link to our Discord channel, so give those a look. Moving on to the upper bounds of the power curve, we have tier 2, starting out with Daughters of Kane. The Daughters of Kane 3.0 book is a very fun book. I've played it a few times recently, and for the most part, what I've noticed between the changes is the power is exactly the same, more or less, but with just some different internal balancing between units. So, Daughters of Kane have stayed right where they used to be. Then we have the Slaves to Darkness. Their power is more or less exactly the same. They are going to get a tome in December or November for the Winter Battle tome, and it's looking to be a really big update. So we'll see what that does to their power levels. But as of right now, Slaves to Darkness are a pretty solid faction. Now we have Soulblight Gravelords. Soulblight Gravelords have very much benefited from expert conquerors because they can field a massive amount of cheap bodies that are going to be really tough to chew through and get off of objectives. So your skeleton spam, your zombie spam is going to be that much better for you to play around. Then we have Legions of the First Prince after successive nerfs to Be'lakor, Kairos Fateweaver, Lord of Change, etc. The Legion of the First Prince has been booted down a tier. They're still very, very powerful, but they are no longer as scary as they once were. So they are tier 2 now. Then in a meteoric rise, we have the Night Haunt. The old Night Haunt book used to be one of the worst battle tomes in Age of Sigmar, but with their new 3rd edition book, they have the tools they need to succeed and thrive. Night Haunt are a fantastic book, and they have definitely earned a spot in Tier 2. Now we move on to Tier 1. In a rather astounding rise, we have the Sylvanath. Now, this might be personal bias as I play Sylvanath the most. They are my main faction, and they are the mascot of this channel. But from my personal experience and from people I've talked to, as well as tournament data, the new Sylvanath book is really powerful. Sylvanath have unparalleled mobility and board control through their wildwoods, the new units, the new war scrolls, the sub-faction within a sub-faction, and their built-in fire and fade or strike and fade, where they can hit you, but you cannot hit them. A good Sylvanath player will be able to move in such a way that you won't be able to touch them unless they want you to do that. So Sylvanath are a really, really good faction right now. They still have a massive skill ceiling, and new players, it'll be a little bit hard to master, but that is my thoughts on the new Sylvanath book. The Deepkin have stayed where they were previously. They still have their fantastic turn 3s and all of the wonderful fight firsts that come with it. The Luminous Realm Lords new book is coming out very soon in the same time frame as the Zinc book, so we will see what that changes. But at the time of recording, Luminous Realm Lords are still very powerful. The various shooting blobs with ranged mortal wound spam and Sivrith and all kinds of stuff like that. Luminous Realm Lords are still pretty powerful, but they're harder to play with some nerfs here and there. War clans, or more specifically Iron Jaws and to a lesser extent Big Wop, have stayed on top in my opinion. The 2 Maw Crushers lists that have been floating around are always scary to fight against if you don't have ways to deal with it, and so they earn a spot in Tier 1. Serafon do as Serafon have always done with their book. They have good magic, good monsters, and good movement. So Serafon are exactly where they were previously. I think that they will probably stay this way for a long time as their rules are just very good. Next up is something I've been surprised by. It is the Maggotkin of Nurgle. This has been something I've noticed a lot lately, is the Maggotkin have made probably the best use of Galatian veterans, or some of the best use that I've personally seen, in that the lists floating around that are stomping tournaments have been very heavily skewed towards Puscoil Blightlords, so that they can make use of bounty hunters to rip apart enemy Galatian veterans, but they themselves are not Galatian veterans, and so they are harder to deal with in return. Maggotkin of Nurgle have seemingly all the tools they need to deal with the new meta that has emerged from Season 1. Lastly, in Tier 1 is the Stormcast Eternals. Despite all the nerfs to the Dragon list, Stormcasts are still just as powerful. They might be a little bit weaker, but Stormcast are still really scary to fight. And that was the updated tier list for August 2022. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like or a comment, and if you want to see more of this type of content in the future, consider subscribing. This has been the Wargrove of Woe, and I'll talk to you guys next time.